Welcome back, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth session of our day-long symposium workshop, The Media and Us, Critical Media Literacy and Engaged Politics, brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with Project Censored and the Media Revolution Collective. Here we are at the midpoint of this remarkable event. So much has been covered and so much more to come. This next session is the Midday Plenary on Critical Pedagogy. Mickey Huff will moderate a conversation with the Media Revolution Collective members on critical media literacy pedagogy as activism. Mickey Huff is the director of Project Censored and president of the Media Freedom Foundation. We have posted extensive bios for our session participants in the City Lights website. We're going to be including links to those in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. For the sake of brevity, we're kind of running low on time, so just going to try to make sure if you want to learn more, just link those, and check them out. We're also posting links to Project Censored's books that City Lights is selling, also to the book which inspired today's symposium, Media and Me. And also want to remind everyone, we're going to be posting every single session on YouTube. So if you've missed one or are going to miss one, you'll be able to look at them at your own leisure. All of today's sessions are intended to be interactive, so we encourage you all to please communicate with each other and our session leaders via the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. Also want to remind everyone, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I would like to take this moment to acknowledge and honor those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So please welcome Mickey Huff to kick off the proceedings at this midpoint of our event. Welcome, Mickey and collective members.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thanks to you and thanks to everybody at City Lights. It's, again, an honor to be here with you all for the day. And it's especially great to see some familiar names in the audience sticking with us through what is a long Saturday. But we're really grateful. And I want to thank everybody here for being here. And we're looking forward to the participatory stages as well, right? We're all going to say a few things about today's the topic of the plenary, which is critical pedagogy. Critical thinking is an integral component, big part of critical media literacy framework. We talk about this in the book. We talk about understanding logical fallacies, cognitive biases to help people detect propaganda and disinformation, but also it helps people to determine the validity of their own beliefs, their own positions. So this isn't, just about gotcha in order to sort of find out where other people's shortcomings are in argumentation. It's also to make us better independent thinkers and maybe build confidence in the ideas we have. And we apply this analytical process to media and how media impacts society, right? And this is all part of what is all part of this helps us become more critically media literate citizens. That's that term Allison Butler was rolling out earlier today. Quite a phrase, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue per se, but it really is what we're striving for. In order to be meaningfully civically engaged, we have to understand our information ecosystem and our media ecosystem, and we have to understand how information is framed and shaped and who produces information and what narratives seem to have legs and which ones get ignored or we don't hear at all. And of course, we heard some of that earlier today in the panel on representation. That's another one of the chapters in the book. So really quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the background in critical thinking, and I'm going to hand it over to everybody else here. And then I might go back and do a little bit more specific. I might do some specific examples. I've been teaching critical thinking at college for over 20 years, and I teach critical reasoning and history. And so I do a lot of past to present, right? I look critically at the past so we have a more meaningful understanding of the present. But it's also very important to understand how the present shapes the way we view the past, right? It's kind of this cycle, this loop. And a lot of what I teach in history or social justice or political economy, I teach these different topics. The core of it is always critical thinking and critical pedagogy, right? It's asking about the power structures and how information is shaped, how it controls in many ways the things that we're able to even consider or think about. In fact, interestingly, from the historical perspective, Peter Kuznick and Oliver Stone's great book, The Untold History of the United States, which is 10 years old this year, they start out the book by talking about how we have, because of the way the past is taught, and because of the way, I would argue, that media shapes the present, corporate media shape the present, it really limits our imagination. In many ways, it limits what we even may think or remember is possible. And so for all my courses, critical thinking is really at the core of it. And part of that core means understanding how to construct logical arguments. And in many of my classes, I literally talk about common fallacies, how we avoid informal fallacies, and we list at least like 30 of these things, right? And the interesting thing is they sometimes have names that are confusing to students, or they don't initially understand what the phrase or term might mean. But as soon as you start explaining what it is and show them examples of it historically or in the present, they tune in right away. And as we said earlier today, and then as Ben mentioned Ben Boynton mentioned in the last session, the folks that we wrote this book for are a teenage audience, and they do have innate built-in BS detectors, right? They can kind of smell phoniness from miles away. And again, I'm riffing on what Ben said earlier today. Whenever they start to realize how they might be manipulated or they might be had, as it were, they really kind of get interested, and they're like, well, how did that happen? Or how was I tricked or fooled into believing a certain thing? And so I use that hook with students, and we find real-time examples about how fallacies work. And I think even more than that, we go in and talk a lot about objectivity as maybe something we aspire to, but is not possible to really achieve. And we talk about cognitive biases and their effects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. Unconscious and implicit bias, confirmation bias, Dunning-Kruger effect, in-group bias. These are really important things, I think. Motivated reasoning or inferred justification. Again, these start to sound like, again, clinical terms or buzzwords or jargon. But as soon as we define them, and we do that in the book, we also have a great glossary in the book, Media and Me, in the back. As soon as we start defining them, students start to see these examples all over the place, and they can start calling them out among each other in class. And I mean, actually, for me, maybe I have a warped sense of what's fun, but for me, that's always been fun. Deconstructing messages, finding fallacies, that's been it's always been interesting to me. So I'm going to talk, and again, I'm going to connect this over to the critical pedagogy part and teaching as activism. I mean, this isn't a new concept. Obviously, Paulo Freire, the late great Howard Zinn picked up on this in a lot of ways. You can't be neutral on a moving train, right? It was one of his buzz phrases. And again, that goes at the core of what is objectivity. And none of us are truly objective. None of our media sources are truly objective. And once students, I think, really start to understand that, they can embrace that concept and understand what our biases are, what our own biases are, what the biases of others are. And I think that helps them navigate, a really complicated information ecosystem that we inhabit. And I know for me, the work we do at Project Censored is based on this. It's really based on a media activism that promotes critical thinking about media. It highlights Andy Lee Roth and I, and Andy's going to talk here in a little bit. We always talk about the project as being critical, but also affirmative. We critique corporate media and platforms, but then again, we go and affirm where independent journalists and other sources do really solid reporting and the kind of reporting we need. And so it exists. It does exist, even in our crazy propaganda world of 24/7, the noise machine and social media or anti-social media. There really are great journalistic sources. When we get into the fourth panel later, Andy and I are going to talk a lot about news literacy and journalism. But for now, we're talking about this connection as critical pedagogy, teaching as activism. And for me, this is really what's at the core of my teaching. I teach for a purpose. And of course, one of the purposes is to get students excited about certain subjects or topics, but it's mostly just to help them stoke the fire in them that they already have, right? And meet them where they are and say, well, what about, so when I teach history, there's something in history for everyone, right? I always say that. People are trained, history's boring. I'm like, well, that's probably because you're boring or the person that was teaching it was boring. History in of itself isn't boring. And when we go in and we find channels or find places in journalism where stories excite people, that's where they can begin pursuing those interests. And that's what we do in Media and Me. And that's what our study guide does, the resource guide that Micah Card did. And that's what we hope people will take away from this. So I'm going to stop yammering right now because I want to hand it over to all the rest of the folks from our collective that are here to have a few words as they want to. We are, of course, delighted to be joined again by Raina Robinson, Allison Butler, Maria Cecilia Soto, Ben Boynton, and of course, my longtime friend and colleague at Project Censored, Andy Lee Roth. So for this segment, maybe I'll hand things over to Allison first, and we can just go around the group, however it organically works. I just wanted you all to say a few things about critical pedagogy and how that part of the book, again, these are parts of the book that I particularly worked on, chapters 2 and 7 on critical thinking and journalism. But again, it's the thread of the entire book. The thread of the whole book, and the thread of critical media literacy, is about critical thinking as the core of it, which probably isn't shocking that right after we discuss what is media or what are media, we go right into critical thinking. And I think that that's a great foundation that sets up the way the rest of the text is written. And again, it's been an honor to work with all the folks on this wonderful book. So Allison, can you take it away for a little bit and maybe talk about your thoughts on this issue?
Sure. I mean, I think critical pedagogy is just embedded into how I teach. In some ways, it might be irrelevant. I mean, it's relevant to my own area of knowledge, but irrelevant what I teach. Everything is organized through critical pedagogy. Everything is organized through asking questions. Most of the material, most of the work that I teach at UMass is in either representations of education in the media or specifically a course on media literacy. And part of my motivation for any of that is to see the world in a different way, to see the media, to see education, that which we live in, right? That which we live within all the time in a different way. This semester, I'll share a quick story about sort of applying critical pedagogy, particularly with new college learners. I'm teaching a class this semester. It's a first semester seminar for first year students. And, UMass is a pretty big university. Many of these students are going to be in classes with 200-300 people. So the faculty led seminars are an opportunity for first semester students to be in a small class. It's capped at 18 students, 19 students. And the theme that I'm doing for this class is Hollywood Goes to College. So it's how college has been represented in mainstream, a variety of media. We look at film, we look at TV, podcasts, listen to music, read newspaper articles, etc. And I've sort of structured the class so the beginning of the semester was media about preparing to go to college. And as we get to the end of the semester, what it means to graduate from college. So the other day, in my last content class, because we'll wrap it up next week with more of a reflective period, we watched the opening 49 seconds of St. Elmo's Fire, which is the opening 49 seconds is the group of friends at their college graduation. And we watched those 49 seconds, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times. And each time they found something slightly new. Each time they found something slightly different. They commented on the music, which was sort of melancholy. They commented that at the end of the 49 seconds, when the group of friends are walking across a field, there's the background noise of a car crash, but it has nothing to do with the images that they're looking at. They commented on the fact that it looks like they're walking away from college, right? Because they're walking across a field, sort of through the viewer, as it were, away from a building. They commented that they're all white. They started to try and deconstruct the characters based on the clothing that they were wearing underneath their caps and gowns and sort of how they were wearing it. And this was an hour-long conversation about 49 seconds of a movie that actually really isn't about graduation. They also noticed that they were alone, right? In St. Elmo's Fire, they've just graduated from Georgetown University in the heart of Washington, D.C., and yet there's 7 characters walking across a college campus by themselves with no other students, as well as with no family. And although these, my students just started college, 12, 13 weeks ago, they they've been told what their college graduation is going to be like for ages. And they expect their families to be there, and they expect it to be crowded. And they certainly don't expect a car crash immediately afterwards, symbolically or otherwise. And that's sort of just my latest story about what really matters about critical pedagogy, is this idea of, what are we presented with? What are we taught to believe in a certain way? How can we question that? And where do we fit in that story? Whoever we is in this case, right? We can mean a lot of different people. And for them, it's the end of their first semester of college, and how so much of what they're taught is always about preparing for what's next. And what does it mean to just sort of live right now? And to try and understand the world that we're living in today. And again, how a teeny tiny slice of a somewhat silly movie from the mid 1980s can actually be a mechanism for really thick, really complex, really complicated deconstruction. So that's just sort of in a nutshell kind of what I value about critical pedagogy, is just the endless opportunities we have to engage, to play, to deconstruct, to learn more about ourselves, and to learn more about others.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the spirit of a lot of what is throughout the media in me, through all the chapters. I think that has that ethos. I'm going to do what Allison did earlier today. I'm going to just go across the screen in the order folks are, at least from my end, to hear from our panelists from Project Censored and the Media Revolution Collective. Raina Robinson, do you want to chime in on this?
Yes, sure. So just listening to both of you speak more recently, Allison, it kind of brought up a few different ideas that I also think is constantly a theme throughout the book, is really just and I say it again, the encouragement of really critical questioning. And that's really, and a lot of times we put a lot of focus on the critical thinking, which I feel like the questioning that we encourage is equally as important. We are really encouraging young people to question ideologies, practices, systems, and more specifically the systems in which they operate in, or have some proximity to, which is extremely powerful to be a young person and already beginning that journey. And then I think something that as far as critical media literacy that is extremely important as a part of this book is we also call out different events, organizations, experiences that the young people may have had, and given them an opportunity to dissect, to create their opinions, to find deeper meaning, to discover causes, which is something it's developing that agency in a young person to feel like they have power over where they see their lives going, which is extremely important. And something that we might not have said, but also want to draw attention to, is just the idea of identity. I feel like that this book also, through self-knowledge, self-discovery, will also be a positive tool for young people to develop identity. Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Raina. Thank you. Next up, Ben Boynton.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to everybody to give their takes, and I think there's a cool thread, going on here. I see all this stuff. I hear all these things in social media and in conversations with, teachers over the last 20 years of my time in the biz, as we say. And I hear this thing about, oh, we need courses in critical thinking. We need courses in critical thinking. I'm like, what are you talking about? What? I mean, that's absurd. Like, teaching critical thinking should be just teaching. A crazy idea, I know. And I think that's real. Like, I did that when I was teaching English, right? We looked at, novels and stories and plays, and we tried to talk about what was beneath the surface and not just necessarily in the sort of literary sense. Of course, I did all that stuff with, literary devices and whatnot, but let's look at what's going on. Let's analyze our own reactions. Let's look at why we have those reactions. All that stuff is really, really important. Today, I'm working more with students on sort of self-directed learning. Actually, I call myself a collaborator in their self-driven learning. And just in conversations with students, we're still doing that critical thinking idea, even if it's a conversation that's not about their specific work, right? It's not necessarily about building a course. We're just having a talk about life. And I'm kind of asking questions and encouraging them to ask questions and trying to get them to think, critically about the world in which they exist. And so we can turn that into media literacy. Of course, we can take that turn. It's been my pleasure to work with these folks now for quite a while, being involved with Project Censored for several years now, and sort of expanding those horizons. Mickey brought up Freire earlier today, and I feel that too. And several years ago, I started working on a critical action framework. And this is the part where I think we talk about teaching critical thinking. And of course, when we talk about it, these folks that I'm sitting here with, we are talking about using it for action, for agency, for identity. But so often when people talk about critical thinking, they're like, oh yeah, just so you understand, like that's the end goal, right? Critical thinking has to lead to critical action. And that's sort of core to, I think, what I do. That's core to what the book wants to do. The book ends not by accident with real life applications and ideas and ideas for action. And so I think it's fair to say that we would love feedback on that from people who start to use this book in whether they read it for themselves, whether they give it to their, nephew, whether they pull it into a class. We would love to hear some feedback about that over time, because that's what we want, right? We want action coming out of the critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ben. And just a reminder, Allison mentioned earlier, and we mentioned earlier today, the last chapter of the book is what do you want to do, right? It's literally pulling in, inviting, asking, right? It's not telling students what to do. It's, well, what do you want to do after all of this? After this thread of critical media literacy and critical thinking about media, what do you want to do? And we, of course, offer 10 steps. We use the acronym from Media and Me. Yes, we're that clever. But we use that literally as a 10-step kind of program. And then we offer a lot of these resources. So we hope that people will give feedback and add to that list of things that we can all do. With that, I want to now go over to Andy Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored.
Thanks, Mickey, and thanks for everyone who came back for a second round of critical media literacy this afternoon. Earlier in the day, Allison mentioned the diversity of the authors and how important it was for us to have a diversity of perspectives among the people writing the book, because we intend it to be addressed to a diversity of readers. And in doing so, Allison mentioned that some of us were theoretically inclined. And I think I'm one of those people Allison had in mind. But I want to tie that into critical pedagogy now. My background is as a sociologist, and I've taught courses in classical sociological theory and contemporary sociological theory. These are not the courses most undergraduates are excited about when they declare sociology as a major. And so one of my challenges in those contexts was to show them how, theory is relevant to daily life. And I think that is, I'm pleased and proud that the Media and Me has a streak of that in it. And I think it fits entirely with, it's not theory for the sake of theory, to riff on the idea that Ben just mentioned about its understanding to promote informed and engaged action. Theory is useful not when it's opaque or abstract, but when it helps us see things more clearly, when it helps us, as we talked about earlier today, see beneath the surface and beyond what we might otherwise take for granted as natural or just so, or it's always been that way. And here I'm thinking of one of the most important insights in my work from the late Audre Lorde, who said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And there's a lot to be said for various ways we might define masters and tools and houses. But for me, as a sociologist, and for the work I do with Project Censored, One of the ideas is that if we don't have tools to call into question commonplace understandings that reinforce the status quo in all the ways it's systemically inequitable and cruel and inhumane will continue to exist, right? So I'm talking about kind of these sort of givens, right? The idea that in the United States, the best will rise to the top, or that markets are the only way that we can allocate scarce resources, right? These little nuggets of sort of conventional wisdom that people are socialized to accept as normal, natural, just the way it is, that we need tools to pry those open and expose them for what they are, which is constructs that benefit some groups of people at the expense of others. And so one of the things that's in The Media and Me, in the chapter where we introduce what are media, is a set of theoretical frameworks that have been used over the years to explain what are known in communication and sociology of media courses as, quote, media effects. That is, how do media impact the people who are its, in the kind of old language, its audiences, its consumers, right? And one model of media effects that was predominant for a very long time was one that gets sometimes referred to as the hypodermic needle model. And the idea was that mass media, the producers of mass media messages, they were simply injected into audiences and consumers who were defenseless to resist or do anything other than just have that become internalized as if it was their own. And that hypodermic needle model of media effects was, as I say, predominant for some time in scholarly circles where people were trying to make sense of the power of media. But in the 1970s, Stuart Hall began to develop an alternative model that has become, that he called and is now known widely as an encoding decoding model. And the idea was that this is a radically different conception of how media impacts the people who use and consume it. The encoding decoding model assumes that the audiences are active interpreters of media content, of media messages. The encoding is done by the media producers, but the decoding is done by you and me, ordinary people who are reading a magazine, watching a TV series, hearing a song on a streaming service, reading the newspaper, or hearing a podcast. In Hall's model, we accept, reject, or perhaps negotiate the meaning of that content. And all the action here, I think, is, first off, the audience is now an active participant, right? They're no longer a passive audience. This is what we mean in the book when we talk about becoming media literate citizens, right? Active participants in the media meaning-making process. And the idea that we can negotiate meanings means that like when a TV show, it has embedded in it a message that the best rise to the top, and if you aren't succeeding, you must be lazy or stupid or whatever. The encoding decoding model that Stuart Hall promoted gives us tools to question what are the implications of this content. And we don't have to accept it. We can build alternatives ourselves. We can critique this. We can build radical alternatives to it. And that, to me, is maybe one kind of example of how a critical media literacy can provide tools that aren't part of the reinforcing of the existing house, that are maybe ways to imagine different and better futures.
Thanks, Andy. Very important information. And again, this is the kind of stuff that's we talk about this stuff in the book. And again, I'll repeat this. We're talking up to young people. We're really trying to present some of these ideas, which some folks would say are, well, these are complicated, or we don't get to that until college. And with a lot of the stuff in the book, we don't believe in that. We don't agree with that. It's really not too young. I'm almost never too young to be teaching about critical thinking and critical media literacy. We really have to do it. It's a survival tool and mechanism. So we want to hear next from Maria Cecilia Soto and then Nick Baham. So Maria.
Hello. My name is Maria Cecilia Soto. I'm currently an undergraduate student in applied linguistics and linguistics. And talking about Stuart Hall, talking about encoding and decoding, that brought up the thought process with me. Children learn how to speak, or they learn how to sign by watching their caregivers, by listening to their caregivers. And they are, the caregivers speak, we encode a message, and the children are able to decode that. They start learning so young. Why would we wait to teach them about critical thinking? If they're able to encode such complex messages, they're able to assign a string of sounds to a person. Oh, that's mama. Oh, that's dada. Why would they not be able to understand what we're talking about when we're trying to share the thought process of critical media literacy? And of course, like a 2-year-old may not have the vocabulary necessary to completely participate in critical media literacy at the level that we are, and at the level of the book as well. This is for young people, but not for infants. It can be applied to anyone of any age. To be critical is not to be cynical, and I think that we made that point earlier in the day, and I think that that's worth bringing up again, especially when you're talking about this in terms of pedagogy, because no matter what age you are as a learner, as a teacher, there's always something more for you to interrogate, to work with. And I really love this about the book, is because in the book we have like the sections applying the knowledge that you just got, or using terminology in a meaningful way. Just like with language, to become fluent in a language that is not your native one, you have to be able to be creative with it. It goes the same for critical media literacy. You have to be able to put your hands in it, to dig in deep, and to think about things in different ways. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful, like another string that we have in this book, is being able to provide these opportunities of deep thinking, and also making questions, creating meaningful questions. It doesn't have to stop just in the classroom. You can use this in the library. You can use this at the coffee shop. You can use this right here, right now. What am I saying? Why am I saying it too? Use it with your friends. Oh, what did you mean by that? Oh, I didn't know about that. Can you tell me more? Things like that. Yeah, I could go on and on about this, but thank you guys very much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Maria, and such important points. This is a critically media literate household over here. The 15-year-old and the 11-year-old are, maybe through osmosis, but they're forever deconstructing the things that are happening, and they're, good enough. This is a sign that you're doing something right. Is they're constantly challenging me. Or my wife, like, what are we doing? What did you just say? What are we doing? It keeps you on our toes. And again, I'll dare say this: I think it's fun. It's enjoyable. I mean, I really think that it's a richness in life that I think is just really, really so important. And that's why we're so happy to share this with young people in this book, The Media and Me. And I want to hand things over now, last but certainly not least, to Nick Baham. Nick, join the conversation.
Well, I have some pretty difficult acts to follow there from Maria and Raina, and then when Andy's going to drop an Audre Lorde and a Stuart Hall reference in one discussion. Okay, I'm ready to keep listening. But I have been obviously, an ethnic studies professor for a couple of decades, and so engaged in ethnic studies pedagogy and critical pedagogy, and we have tried to follow some of the dictates of Paulo Freire, and to consider that we're in communities, that education is dialogue. And so I really respect what you've also said, Mickey, about the way things happen in your family. That's sort of the way that it happens here too. And I get critiqued all the time by my son, but we're engaged in dialogue, and that's fundamental to education. But also we're engaged all the time in helping our students to transform their world. What I think I can offer to this discussion, in addition to what I've just mentioned about my own work in ethnic studies, is that I have already shared this book with students who want to start their own podcast. And you may not know that Nolan and I wrote a book called The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism. And I see these kinds of things as being compatible. And what I've talked with students about is using Media and Me and things like The Podcaster's Dilemma, a lot of the books that have been, if not all of them, that have been published through Project Censored, including our annual review of stories that that never made the news that never made the news, as a way of sort of using those as a manual for what they can do, the kinds of stories that people want to hear. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in the last discussion, the first breakout session, is that my experience with folks in Maria's generation, when I taught Reina, is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is one of the things I love about teaching, actually. This is the generation that's done. They're absolutely done with the colonial frameworks. They're through. And I don't think people, and this really came up in the Podcaster's Dilemma, but it's in the Media and Me too. I don't think people really understand how done they are with all things colonial. That extends to how you dress, how you eat, how you speak, how you have to comport yourself within a social setting. All of these kinds of things. They're just done with it. And I think it's really exciting to be in spaces with people like that. I think it's also exciting to have a book like The Media and Me that addresses that hunger that young people have to just get on with it and get beyond that colonial space. I know in my generation, we were tired of it, but we were also, when I was in school, we were still talking about the fact that South Africa was under the boot of apartheid. And so we had that hill to climb. And then there were other civil rights struggles that were going to come up that we had to climb because we hadn't done anything about policing. Still haven't really done anything about policing. Even in the wake of George Floyd, we need more substantive stuff. Young people are much farther ahead than that. They're building another world for themselves that doesn't have anything to do with the colonial dictates, that's fully decolonized. And so being able to offer them something in the way of understanding media and the way that media divides, the way that media manipulates stereotypes, the way that media prevents us from interethnic coalition building, and actually the way that media does something that makes it impossible for us to be human beings. It doesn't afford us the opportunity to deeply listen to one another and understand where we are coming from so that we can effectively communicate with one another. Providing young people with that understanding, I think, is fundamental to their own decolonization efforts. And, as an older person, look, it's not my fight, but as a professor, I think it's incumbent upon me. I'm required to provide some ammunition for those who are on the front lines. And I'm happy to be a part of a book that can do that. And then also to have these exciting young writers and thinkers in the mix.
Thanks so much, Nick. You're so right. I agree with so much of what you said. It's really an honor and a privilege to work on a book like this with so many amazing people, and our artist Peter Glanting, who did such great illustrations. I really hope people look at the illustrations Pete did. They're very thoughtful and very connected and thought-provoking. And I think that that's another thing that we also try to encourage is critical thinking, critical pedagogy, and activism through art, through music, through other kinds of expression, not just the written word. And we understand that's what animates and excites young people too. That's what they're excited about. And so, if we get stuck, I'll riff on this for a second, Nick. If we get stuck in whatever our age group is, right, the over 50 club here for me. If we don't seem interested in what they're doing, what younger people are doing, where we're at, then we're missing these big opportunities to connect those generational those dots, right? It's really, and we have so much to learn from young people. And again, that's like, I'll say it's an honor and a privilege, not just to work with the folks here, but I'm honored and privileged every day when I think about my students and teaching. The fact that I get to teach at a community college with so many diverse people at Diablo Valley College, it's really rich and rewarding in the classroom. I got to say, online has been some challenging stuff the last couple of years, and in fact, Censored Press has a book about that. It's called Going Remote by Adam Bessie, an English professor colleague of mine at Diablo Valley College, with the illustrator Pete Glanting. The book Going Remote talks about that challenge of shifting online and big tech and surveillance and isolation. That book's coming out in February from the Censored Press, and maybe we'll do another one of these for that. But again, I think that that's really what underscores a lot of what's going on in this book, is that we're all just so excited about teaching and so excited about getting the message across. And again, it goes back to where we started, the critical pedagogy, and teaching is our activism in a lot of ways. And we're all students and we're all teachers. And I think that that's the message that's in the book. And I really hope people take that message away. And I know Ben mentioned this earlier in the chat about the challenging of authority. I have it right in my syllabus. Don't trust the latest Hollywood tripe or the talking head pundit on TV without checking it out. And you know what? Don't trust me either. And I don't get to quote Ronald Reagan very often, but when I do, trust but verify, right? Trust but verify. The idea that you might have trust, or you might have trust that someone's not misleading you, but it's important to verify that information. So at this point in our conversation, I'd really like to include everybody else here. So anybody else here that has a question, a comment, I see some people sharing great things. Ecoversities, Mara, thank you so much for sharing that. Critically new approaches, very good. Does anybody else here in the audience, anybody have a question or comment? Yeah, Andy, go ahead. Andy, you're muted, I'm sorry.
I just seen in the chat, Genevieve noted it's not easy for a student to question the teacher system. Yeah. And I'd like to hear what my co-authors think about that, how we overcome those hurdles or barriers. Thinking for myself, I think one of the answers to that challenge is to have students see that we don't know everything ourselves. Right. And that there's a difference between knowing and figuring out. And in a classroom, I think what I'm expert at as a teacher is figuring things out, but it doesn't necessarily mean I know everything. And there will be topics where I won't know what I think until we start talking about it. And having dialogue is part of how we figure out what we think. And writing is how we figure out what we think. I think too often in school systems now, writing is taught as what you do at the end when you already know what you want to say. And in my classrooms, I would always emphasize writing is a means of figuring out what you think and what you believe. And that changes how you approach the task of writing, which most students are not eager to get into when they have an assigned essay or something, report. But having, I think one way to encourage students to question their teachers and other authority figures is to model in a classroom or other settings like that I don't know everything. And one thing that, I wish I was teaching a class right now, because one of the things I've been wrestling with that I know I would understand better if I had a chance to talk about it with students right now is the closure of the online digital Z library, which is this platform that for some time now, actually officially all the way back to 2009, made PDF and EPUB versions of books available online for free. This clearly runs afoul of all kinds of copyright laws. And unfortunately, I suppose from a profit money grubbing perspective, the fact that a number of Project Censored yearbooks were available on Z Library meant that the project was being, deprived of a certain number of book sales by this platform that distributes books without charge, right? And the library that Z Library, you know, the holdings that Z Library had were incredible. Z Library was shut down in October by the FBI and the Department of Justice. And if you try to go find their domain now, you'll see that the domain has been seized. So there's this dilemma to me about, on one hand, I understand and even have perhaps some interest as the co-author of a number of, as the co-editor or co-author of a number of books like copyright law, and how if books aren't paid for, they're, in a profit-driven system, they won't be produced or distributed. On the other hand, the notion of Z Library was that books ought to be available. Books shouldn't be commodities. They're sources of information. And we're back to this human rights issue about freedom of information as crucial to people's development as individuals and crucial to societies that claim to be democratic in their governance. And so to me, there's this, I don't mean to turn this into a symposium about the ethical dilemmas posed by Z Library, but that's exactly the sort of thing, like, I don't know what to think about that. I'm missing Z Library as someone who used it, but I didn't until now ever talk about that publicly because I knew something about Z Library was a little sketchy, not on the up and up, right? And so, yeah, that's the kind of thing, like, I would want to discuss with students in a classroom. Like, well, what are the ethics of that? What are the power dynamics at work? What are the trade-offs? And I think having students see that we as, if we're in the role of teacher or professor or whatever, that we don't necessarily know everything, but we know how to ask questions that are useful. I think that's an important way to overcome some of that hierarchy of authority and lack of authority in the classroom and maybe elsewhere.
Yeah, Andy, I would agree with your point. And then to Maura's comment about certain faculty not being able to recognize their own fallibility, and obviously within some of those more risky positions, no doubt about it. I think there is something to be said, unfortunately, about that acknowledgement of not knowing from a teacher in the classroom. Students can read that in multiple ways. I think some students will read it as, this is somebody who's willing to work on this project of learning with me. But I think some students might be threatened by it, of like, wait a minute, if they don't know everything, then why am I here? Why am I paying X number of thousands of dollars in tuition? Aren't they supposed to be the expert, right? So one of the things that I try and do with my classes is ask them sort of what they know and how they know it. Sometimes I try and be really transparent about what it is that I know and how I know it. And I think I've also picked up on what was, quite frankly, back to some of the discussions about being critical conversationists in the home front. One of the things that from my adolescence that I thought was really super annoying, but now I'm like, oh, I've become that, is we were never really allowed to say, I don't know, at the dinner table. It wasn't that we weren't supposed to know, like, it wasn't that we weren't allowed to know, but it was always a project of, so if you don't know this, what do you want to do to learn about it? How do you want to figure it out? And so I try and really embrace with my classes that, not knowing stuff is actually really fun. And that not knowing stuff is a really, like, it can be really exciting. And at what point in our worlds did not knowing stuff become threatening, right? I mean, you look to some extent at like small children, at toddlers, and the idea of not knowing stuff is a thrill, right? And yet then at some point in our classrooms, we're to stop being that, and we're to just be obedient or not ask the wrong questions, whatever the heck that means, right? And so I try and do it as a little bit of a dance of asking questions as a way of celebration, and then that we never stop asking questions, and that we do ask them of our institution, because it's asking questions doesn't automatically equal either stupidity on our parts or threat on our parts. That it can be, Andy, to your words from earlier today, it can be curiosity, right? How does our institution make decisions about things? How do things come to pass? And let's see what what we learn might be upsetting. There's no doubt about it. But it also means that we're going to be more informed and less in the dark. And can't that also be seen as a little bit of an adventure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Anybody else?
I
Yeah.
think it's
chime
also
in.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think it's also modeling humanity. When we talk to students and we say, I don't know, and Allison point taken about the threatening nature or the questioning of, how dare you not know something, you're the expert. Like, I think I get that from, like, I've heard students say that about teachers. But I want to also add that this is not a problem only of higher ed, where teachers are either afraid or possessed of such a sense of self that they think they are the authority. Absolutely exists, K to 22, it's all the way through. And I think that the way to do that is sort of like exactly what Allison and Andy were both saying, this idea of admitting you don't know, figuring out how to frame that with your students. I think, Andy, you said writing is thinking, or you didn't use that exact phrase, but that's like one of my mantras. So I just love that idea of like, that's how we figure it out. And I think that idea that Andy brought up of saying out loud, I don't know what I think about it until we talk about it. That's really powerful framing. And if we could even take that out of our classrooms and into our lives, we sit on social media and we declaim things. And, I have a friend of mine on social media, whom some of you have encountered, who knows everything. And it's really frustrating because he just has to, like, everything has to be known and clear and take thousands of words to say. And I'm over here going, I talk about stuff in that format just like I do in real life, that I'm talking about it to decide what I think about it, to understand what I think about it, or to come to a new understanding. And I think that that's, to go back to the original question, like, what do we do to sort of open that up, is we open it up and we open ourselves up. And we have to figure out how to find the comfort level and the issues that Allison raised around. I hadn't thought of that particular framing, Allison, so thank you. But we have to figure out in our context what that means, and that's very individual. So it goes back to my comment earlier about terminating the typical classroom, I might add, with extreme prejudice. We need to get past that and talk about the humanity of it all, which is, I'm going to go look at that eco-diversities page when we're done tonight. Anyway, thank you.
I did want to just comment on something been brought up, which is coming to new understandings and really just trying as educators, creating a culture of changing our minds. It's so frowned upon to change your mind, and that is it's very interesting to me that once someone states an idea or opinion, we're kind of sort of like society's expectations of us is that we stand by it, we live by it, and we die by it. So I think that is something I really appreciate about critical media literacy, is the promotion of the culture, that it's appreciated that you come to new understandings and change your perspectives and ways of thinking.
Yeah, I talk about that in the course that I mentioned earlier. I teach a critical reasoning in history. I use examples from the recent past where I talk about our political culture and our dialogue. We live in a society where you hear on the quote news media people saying things like, well, you're an opportunistic flip-flopper, right? That kind of a thing, which I think is really, again, it's negative, right? It's always negative, or you're inconsistent, or you can't be trusted, right? It's some cardinal sin or crime in U.S. culture to have to change your mind, which is also growing, right, and learning. But just real quick, I wanted to the course I teach is a mouthful of a title, but I wanted to spit it out because I think it encapsulates a lot of what folks have been talking about. I do this with the interplay of history and journalism, past and present. The course is called History in the Making, right? Well, because we're making it. History in the Making, Contemporary Historiography and the Rough Draft of History, meaning that it's not permanent. It's not in stone. We don't know what's going to happen or how it might shake out. The subtitle is a real doozy. It's Today's Fake News is Tomorrow's Fake History, Case Studies in Media Myth-Making and the Propaganda of Historical Construction. So built into the title is you've got to be critically thinking about past, present, future. It's almost you have to be swimming in that matrix simultaneously in different dimensions because it's all related. and so that's what I try to impart in those kind of classes. And it's really rooted in the notion that I don't know everything. I don't know all the answers. When I have students doing the final papers and they're picking their topics about what they're going to historically argue about, it's like, well, what's the right answer? Or what's the, it's really interesting how many students I've had come to me in a critical thinking class and say, what am I supposed to think? And I'm like, well, this course is designed so that you won't ask that question. It'll be part of that process for you. So we have a few minutes left here, and I just wanted to make sure anybody else who wanted to chime in or speak. I know I see Mara. I'd be talking about independent, fact-based, trustworthy media outlets. Well, I'll promise to be talking about that in session number 4 with Andy Lee Roth for sure. And we can put some links here when we talk about journalism and media literacy. But anyone else here in the audience want to chime in, or any of our other panelists want to say something?
If I could just chime in really quick. I graduated high school in 2020. Okay, so I just recently left. I recently came into the university, and it's a very different way of thinking. It's a very different way of operating as a student. And oh my God, I wish that more of my high school teachers, I can't say none of them did, but quite a few of them did, but I wish more of them would have accepted the fact that they don't know everything. It would have been so refreshing to me as a student, and it would have probably opened me up to more topics that I didn't necessarily like. Like, nobody likes math class for some reason. Why is that? Because you don't necessarily get to engage with it in a creative way necessarily, not at least in the pedagogy and in the curriculum that I was taught with, right? And so as a student, as a current student, and as a previous high school student, I think that it is so important for everybody in the classroom to realize that we don't know everything. We're going to learn it to the best of our ability, and we have these tools, we have these textbooks, we have online resources, we have this highly trained individual who's leading our classroom, our teacher, right? But it doesn't mean that we will find the answer everywhere. I remember there was this one instance where it was a parent-teacher open house night type thing, and my mother is mathematically inclined, and the teacher gave a sample equation for us to solve, and my mom solved it in a way that is not written in our curriculum. It's not the way that one would be expected to solve it based on what we learned in the class. And I remember my teacher short-circuiting. He did not understand what was going on at all. And I think that would have been a really opportune moment for that particular teacher to ask, how did you do that? Why did you do that? And then starting to open up that conversation, even giving high schoolers and maybe even middle schoolers opportunities to do independent research of some type so that they can come to a conclusion. I think that we are trained to be critical thinkers a bit too late in our adolescence. So opening up the classroom to more unconventional ways of thinking and learning, I think, is so necessary, especially for middle schoolers and high schoolers.
Well, we hope that the Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people, is that vehicle, right? That really promotes what you just so eloquently said, Maria. It's never too early. In fact, I feel that. In fact, I just said this the other day, hosting a talk on campus with Medea Benjamin about a very controversial subject that people were interacting with, and it's modeling them that it's a safe space to have different views and disagree. But I think the lamentation I had was that I feel like that when the students are coming to college, that I feel like it's never too late. But I do feel like some of them, right? It's like, well, you didn't get this before, or you didn't have this in high school or junior high, and that is why we're teaching it at community college and the college level and freshman courses, is because we have to make sure that people have access to this kind of information. And again, I hope that people find the Media and Me useful in that kind of capacity for helping young people foster critical and independent thinking skills. We are up at the 4 o'clock hour, and I see Peter is back in the room to clean up for us. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here in this session. Thanks to all of our amazing panelists and co-authors. Again, an honor to be here. Peter?
Yeah, I would second that motion. Thank you, everyone. I mean, it's been wonderful to observe just how this day is unfolding, and the discourse has just been flowering into so many different directions, and a lot of material for anyone interested, you know, in following up for future research or ideas for teaching and discussion. So much appreciate the energy and care that all of you have been putting into this. Very, very grateful. So we're past the halfway mark. Our next session will be the third breakout room of the day. It's called Digital Literacy and Advertising. It begins at 4:15 p.m., 7:15 Eastern. Much love to our co-sponsors, Project Censored and the Media Revolution Collective. We hope to see you in the next session.